A peaceful farm, a quiet widow, a forgotten stretch of land in rural Texas. But when a group of armed intruders decide to raid her property thinking she's just another elderly black woman living alone, they have no idea what's coming. Because Ruth Langston isn't just a grandmother tending to her soil, she's a decorated sniper who once served her country in shadows and silence. What follows isn't just a confrontation, it's a reckoning, a fight for dignity, for memory, and for justice that echoes far beyond one dusty fence line. And trust me, by the time this story ends, you'll be thinking twice about the power of quiet resilience. Let us know where and when you're listening. Drop a comment below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in standing their ground. Now, let's begin. The school bell hadn't rung in over a decade, but Ruth Langston still woke up at 5:45 every morning, as if time itself respected her routines. The old farmhouse in Pecos County creaked to life with the familiar sounds of a coffee kettle bubbling and wind brushing dry mesquite branches against the screen door. She moved through the kitchen without turning on the light, her bare feet firm against the cool linoleum, her breath steady as though the rhythm of morning were a kind of unspoken prayer. Outside, the sun was just beginning to paint soft gold across the fields, revealing the outline of her land, 72 acres of stubborn dirt and sun-scorched roots, held together not by fences but by memory and defiance. She poured one mug of coffee, always the same dark roast, always to the very rim, and stepped out onto the porch in her cotton robe and boots, because a Texas morning didn't care for how things looked. The porch boards groaned softly beneath her, a familiar ache in the wood, echoing the ache in her knees, which had never quite forgiven her for the parachute landings in Somalia. Her gaze swept across the pasture with the quiet focus of someone who had spent half her life spotting details in chaos. It was peaceful but not still. There was a difference. Stillness was the absence of movement. This was the kind of peace that hummed with tension just under the skin like a breath held too long. She hadn't taught in nearly 15 years, but the classroom still lived in her posture, straight-back measured tone, the quiet authority that made teenage boys sit up straighter without knowing why. Her name was still etched in fading ink on the cornerstone of the local high school gymnasium, a thank you plaque for 32 years of service and the region's most decorated marksmanship program. Most people forgot she'd retired with medals on her chest, not just chalk on her sleeves. That was fine. She'd never needed reminders. The memories stayed sharper even than the shooting trophies gathering dust in the hall closet. That morning, as she leaned on the railing, one hand wrapped around the warm ceramic mug, something shifted in the wind. It wasn't dramatic, just the kind of subtle change that most people might miss a difference in how the air settled across the grass, or how the birds fell silent all at once. Ruth didn't miss it. Her body tensed slightly, not in fear but in reflex, a ripple that moved from the base of her neck to her heels, like the muscle memory of a woman trained to identify threats before they took shape. Her eyes narrowed. She scanned the horizon, slow and deliberate, pausing on the distant tree line. No movement. No vehicle. But still, something. She didn't say anything out loud, but her fingers tightened slightly around the mug, and she took a slow sip, letting the bitterness ground her in the present. The wind picked up for a moment, carrying the faint scent of dry hay and engine grease. She didn't need to see the truck to know it had been there. Someone had passed through the gravel road just before dawn, careful not to disturb too much dust, but not careful enough to avoid leaving a trail. She would check it later. Right now, she stood still, letting the land speak first. Inside the house, the ticking of the old wall clock filled the space with a steady beat. It had been her husband's favorite clock, a battered old thing from a pawn shop in San Angelo, and though he'd been gone 8 years now, she'd kept it wound as if to remind time that some things couldn't be paused or undone. She walked back inside, pausing by the door to look down at the polished oak floors they'd laid together the year they retired. She could still hear his laugh when they'd spilled varnish all over the living room, still feel the warmth of that memory even now. He'd always said, "Ruth, this land listens better than people ever did," and she believed it. She set her mug on the windowsill, next to the framed photograph of the two of them in uniform, arms slung around each other, eyes bright younger than they had any right to be. She reached down and laced her boots tighter. The air outside felt different now, thicker edged with something that didn't belong. Not fear. Not yet, but that sensation of being watched, of history circling back with its boots on. She had felt it before. In alleys, on patrol, in school board meetings where decisions were made behind closed doors, in towns where power came in the form of handshakes between men who never said what they meant out loud. She grabbed her notebook from the side table, flipped through the pages, slowly, methodically, until she landed on a list she'd started weeks ago. Unmarked trucks, unknown survey markers, noise behind the east fence, suspicious calls to the county recorder's office. She tapped the pencil once against the paper and underlined a single phrase she had written the night before. Watch the silence. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. A skill honed through decades of observation and consequence. As the sun rose higher, Ruth opened the front door again, letting the light pour in. The land before her was unchanged. No smoke, no signs of danger. But she knew better than to trust quiet that came too quickly after motion. She reached for the keys hanging by the doorframe and walked slowly toward the pickup truck parked near the barn. It started with a heavy growl, the kind of sound that echoed across flat land like a warning shot. She didn't drive fast, she never did, but she drove with purpose, heading toward the eastern fence line. Halfway there, she spotted it. A small plastic flag staked in the ground, bright orange marked utility in black ink, but no utility company had logged work on her property. She stopped the truck engine idling and stepped out onto the hard-packed dirt. Kneeling carefully, she examined the area around the flag. The grass had been cut in a perfect semicircle. Too clean, too deliberate. A message not for her approval, but for someone else's permission. Someone thought she wouldn't notice. Someone had underestimated her. Ruth stood slowly brushing the dust from her palms and looked out across the dry field, her shadow stretching long behind her. She didn't feel fear. Not yet. What she felt was older, heavier, an instinct buried so deep it moved like breath. Not everything from war stayed behind on foreign soil. Some things came home with you, some things never left. She turned back toward the house, her steps steady, her eyes scanning the horizon one more time. As she walked past the chicken coop, one of the hens squawked loudly, flapping its wings in brief alarm. Ruth paused, looked up at the sky, then down at the loose feathers scattered in the dirt. A hawk, maybe. Or maybe just timing. She took a breath deep and calm and whispered under her breath, "I'm still here." Then she reached the porch, opened the screen door, and stepped inside the wood floor, creaking once beneath her heel like a sentry acknowledging her return. It started with the sound of gravel being crushed under tires that didn't belong on a ranch road, too smooth, too deliberate, too clean for anyone local. Ruth Langston heard it before she saw the truck, that low, measured crunch that always meant someone was trying not to be heard but still came anyway. She didn't move from the porch, just took one last sip of her coffee, set the mug down on the rail, and let her eyes follow the curve of the driveway as the vehicle rolled slowly into view. It was a black SUV, newer model, tinted windows dark enough to make it look blind from the outside, but she knew someone inside was watching her already. The engine cut off with a soft purr, like the vehicle had come to rest by choice, not command. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, maybe mid-40s, khakis pressed too flat for manual labor blazer, one size too tailored for West Texas. He walked with the casual confidence of someone used to being welcomed, or at least not questioned, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile you practiced in mirrors lined with ambition. "Good morning, ma'am," he called, as if the word ma'am made him more respectful, less calculated. Ruth didn't answer right away. She studied his shoes, clean brown leather soles, barely scuffed. Not a man who'd ever walked this land. He climbed the steps, halfway stopped at the third board, which creaked when weight shifted wrong, and pulled a crisp envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket. "Name's Carson Ward," he said, and she could tell he was waiting for some flicker of recognition, like she might have read his name on a billboard or ballot. "I work with Horizon Development Group. We've been studying land in the region, and well, yours came up in conversation. Beautiful acreage. Valuable, too." His eyes scanned the fields behind her like he'd already taken mental measurements. She didn't blink. "You're trespassing," she said evenly, her voice low but clear, like gravel settling after a long drought. He chuckled just enough to suggest he didn't take her seriously, but not enough to be overtly rude. "Apologies. I thought this might be a good time to talk. I assure you it's worth your while." He held the envelope out again, and this time she took it not out of curiosity, but because she wanted him to stop touching it. The gold embossing on the flap read, "Confidential offer," the kind of vague flourish meant to feel generous, but Ruth had spent enough years reading between the lines to know what offers like this really meant. "You want to buy my land," she said flatly. "We'd like to help you transition," he replied smoothly, into the next phase of life comfortably. With dignity. The word dignity made her jaw tighten. She'd carried bodies from jungle clearings in Nam, taught 3 generations of kids how to survive tornado season, and buried a husband without government help or fanfare. And now a man in polished loafers was offering her dignity like it came in a check. She looked him in the eye for the first time, let the silence stretch until the muscles at the corners of his mouth began to twitch. "If you knew anything about dignity," she said, "you'd have parked outside the gate and walked." For a split second, his expression dropped just long enough for her to see the irritation underneath the charm. He adjusted his cuffs, exhaled through his nose, and tried one last smile. "There's going to be movement in this region, Mrs. Langston. Infrastructure, energy projects, clean development. We're offering people a chance to get ahead of that wave." Ruth looked out across the pasture where her husband had planted rye every spring for 22 years. She could still see the way his shoulders moved when he hoed those first stubborn rows, always before sunup, always in silence. "I'm not interested in waves," she replied. "I'm interested in roots." Carson's voice lost its warmth just a shade. "The offer won't stay on the table long, and I think you know that." She nodded slowly, like someone humoring a child who hadn't yet earned the right to speak with certainty. Then she turned, opened the screen door behind her, and without looking back said, "And I think you'd best head out before my coffee gets cold enough to throw." The door clicked shut behind her. She didn't slam it. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was more powerful than any curse or threat she could have uttered. Inside, the light had shifted. The sun now stretched across the floor in soft gold lines that caught dust in the air, making the room feel older, like a memory that refused to fade. Ruth stood at the table for a long moment before placing the envelope beside the photo of her and James in uniform. She didn't open it right away, just let it sit there like a ticking clock with no sound. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photo frame, James smiling, that quiet, lopsided smile of his, the one he wore right before telling a hard truth. She took a breath slow and steady and whispered, "Looks like they're circling again." Only then did she open the envelope. Inside was a typed letter with no greeting, no signature, just a numbered offer and a non-disclosure clause. Below it, a contact card printed on linen stock, Carson Ward, Strategic Land Acquisitions. She read it twice, then folded it neatly, walked to the iron stove in the corner and fed it to the flames. The paper curled fast, blackened at the edges, turned to ash before the ink had time to melt. She didn't watch it burn. Instead, she opened the back door, stepped into the fading morning, and let the dry air settle around her shoulders like an old shawl. From the porch, she could see the tire marks he'd left in the gravel, too deep, too direct, like someone had assumed they belonged. She walked out barefoot, her soles toughened from years of soil and sun, and with the toe of her foot, she scattered the gravel until the track disappeared. "Not yet," she said softly. "Not this way." Then she stood there for a while, facing east, the horizon stretching wide in that quiet, solemn way West Texas does, when it knows something's coming but refuses to rush it. And somewhere in her bones, Ruth could feel it too, the beginning of a pressure not yet spoken aloud but already building beneath the soil. That afternoon, when the wind quieted and the pecan shadows stretched long across the back pasture, Ruth Langston descended the narrow staircase into the cellar beneath her pantry, moving with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that the slower you go, the steadier your hands stay. The door creaked the same way it always had, hinges worn by decades of West Texas dust, and the steps groaned under her weight with the familiar aging complaint of dry timber. She reached the bottom without a flashlight, letting her fingers guide her along the stone wall, her breath, even her eyes already adjusting to the dimness, like memory was lighting her way instead of electricity. The air smelled of cedar and iron, and something older than either, like secrecy, soaked into the soil and never quite let go. She knelt carefully, her left knee crackling as it touched the floor, and pulled aside 2 sacks of flour stacked neatly over an old rug. The corner of the rug lifted to reveal the hatch oak boards framed with steel bolts sealed shut by a latch worn smooth from years of opening and closing. Ruth paused, her hand resting on the metal, and closed her eyes for just a moment. Her fingers didn't tremble, but there was a heaviness in her palm, the kind that came not from fear but from what had to be remembered. She exhaled slowly, then flipped the latch open with a clean motion, lifting the lid and revealing the compartment below. Inside lay a long cloth-wrapped case that bore no markings, no brand, no logo, just the faded outlines of fingers where it had been lifted and carried more times than she cared to count. She reached for it like she might reach for a child, not with hesitation but with reverence, pulling it free and laying it gently across her lap. She unwrapped it slowly, layer by layer, revealing a custom-built sniper rifle, matte black, with a walnut stock, and a precision scope still covered in a leather sleeve. The weapon had been cleaned every year on her birthday, not out of paranoia, but because habits forged in war didn't rust just because the metals did. She ran her hand along the barrel, then the bolt, then the engraved initials, just under the trigger guard, JL. For James Langston, her husband who had built the rifle with her back when they were both in uniform, both sharp-eyed, both determined to outlive their deployments. "Still clean," she whispered, and the words felt less like a comment and more like a confirmation, a way of reminding herself that though time had pressed down on her bones, it hadn't touched her resolve. She checked the chamber, then the scope mount, then gently set the rifle on the workbench behind her and reached for the smaller sidearm case tucked beneath. Inside was a .45 Colt she hadn't fired in over 5 years, but when she clicked it open and began loading the clip, her fingers moved like they always had, precise, mechanical, unemotional. It wasn't about the bullets. It was about the ritual, about saying, "I remember how." She holstered the sidearm under her coat, rose with effort, and closed the hatch again, sealing the quiet space with a firm pull. As she climbed the stairs back into daylight, the world outside felt brighter but not safer, like the land itself was holding its breath. She walked the property line for the first time in weeks, tracing the fence with one gloved hand, checking each post and knot of wire with the same scrutiny she'd once used to check perimeter lines overseas. A rabbit startled from the underbrush and darted toward the creek bed, vanishing into the mesquites before she could even flinch. She crouched near the old gatepost, running her fingers through the dry soil, and pausing when she felt a groove narrow, deliberate the unmistakable shape of boot tread. Not recent, but not old either. Someone had been here, and they hadn't walked like someone admiring pasture. They'd walked like someone looking for leverage. Back at the house, Ruth laid the rifle on the dining table and began unpacking the cleaning kit. Each movement was silent, but not hurried, like prayer, like song, like memory, guiding her through ritual. Outside, a hawk called once, then twice, before disappearing beyond the tree line. The wind shifted cooler now, and with it came the faint sound of tires on distant gravel. Not close, not yet, but present. She didn't look up. Just clicked the scope into place, wiped the stock with a clean cloth, and muttered, "Next time you send someone, they better come with a reason." The house around her made no reply, but the floor beneath her feet felt solid, almost defiant. Later, after the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the shadows began to stretch and blur like slow-moving fog, she stood barefoot in the kitchen, the cool tile pressing into her arches, her shoulder against the window frame as she stared out at the yard where the first trap had already been set. A tripwire strung between two fence rails hidden under a pile of feed straw looped to a set of chimes she'd repurposed from her teaching days, each tone rigged to trigger a vibration through the floorboards in the living room. Not a sound, not a light, just a whisper through wood and nail that someone had crossed a line. The lights in the house remained dim, drawn by habit, not fear. The curtains stayed half open, just wide enough to see the porch, the gate, the tree line. She boiled a kettle not for tea, but to keep her hands busy, to keep her thoughts anchored while the night outside thickened. She sat at the table, the rifle resting beside her, a map of the property spread out beneath it, and began marking elevation points in red pencil, sketching angles of visibility, known blind spots, and fallback positions. Every inch of that land was familiar, but now she needed it on paper, the way she used to teach students to diagram battlefields in history class. When the kettle whistled, she poured water into a chipped mug and let it steep in silence, her mind moving faster than her hands. "They think you're soft," she murmured to herself, not angry, just aware. "They think years mean surrender." She looked down at the notches etched into the wood at the edge of the table, each one, for a student who had made it to college, each one carved during evenings when the school board refused to fund supplies, and she'd bought them anyway. She ran her finger across the oldest mark dated 1986 and let herself smile just once, brief and tired. Outside, the sky turned dark blue, then black, then something deeper like the earth itself was folding inward. Ruth rose slowly, grabbed the rifle, and walked to the window, standing in the stillness with one hand resting against the pane. She didn't expect movement tonight, but she knew better than to be unready. Readiness wasn't panic. It was peace made practical. She leaned the rifle against the wall beside her boots, turned off the last light in the house, and let the quiet settle fully around her. Then, with a breath that was not heavy but grounded, Ruth whispered into the dark, "I remember who I am." And in the stillness that followed, it felt less like a declaration and more like a return. The night didn't scream when they came. It whispered a shift in the air, a wrongness too quiet to name but too sharp to ignore. Ruth Langston had been sitting by the window with the lights off her coffee, long since cold, and untouched, her breath slow and shallow, her thoughts quiet but alert like a current beneath still water. She hadn't seen headlights, and that told her everything she needed to know. They were coming the way. Wolves moved low, silent, sure of themselves, confident they'd meet only fear and confusion. But Ruth wasn't afraid. She was ready, not out of vengeance or bravado, but because preparation was her oldest form of prayer. She rose without a word, the floorboards beneath her feet, remembering her weight, as if they'd been waiting for this moment too. In the dark, she moved like memory, graceful, deliberate, practiced, and reached for. The rifle leaned against the doorframe, her hands steady as iron. Outside, the wind had stilled, and even the coyotes had gone quiet, as if the land itself was bracing for what would come. She didn't look toward the tree line yet. She didn't need to. She'd spent days walking the perimeter, measuring distance, calculating lines of fire, and marking fallback paths in the dirt with the heel of her boot. She stepped out onto the porch, the screen door creaking softly as it opened, then fell shut behind her with a hush like closing a chapter. The moon hung low and heavy, casting a dull silver glow across the field, but the corners of the property, the places that mattered, remained cloaked in thick shadow. She crouched beside the porch steps and reached into the hollow where she'd stashed her first tripwire. A small vibration trembled beneath her fingertips. Not loud, not violent, but distinct. Someone had entered the zone. She mouthed the word without sound. Now. Down by the far barn, a figure moved, careful but not careful enough. Ruth raised the rifle to her shoulder, her body instinctively aligning to the cold geometry of the sight line. Her cheek pressed against the stock, her eye narrowing behind the scope, the breath leaving her lungs in one long, silent release. She didn't fire. Not yet. Not until she counted 3 more shadows slipping past the north fence, forming a slow arc that was textbook, flanking. Someone had trained them, but not for her. These weren't kids on a dare or men trying to scare a widow into selling. This was a hit squad, and they'd brought tactics to a place where Ruth had planted traps instead of trust. The first man reached the tripwire near the water trough, and she waited until his boot lifted just enough to avoid it, only to step directly onto the second one, buried shallow in the straw wired to a modified signal flare. The burst of light cut the night like lightning sharp and sudden, washing the field in red, and in that moment of frozen exposure, Ruth squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked once, then silence fell again, broken only by the thud of a body hitting dirt. She didn't watch him fall. She was already shifting to the second target, adjusting half a breath to the right, her scope catching the flash of panic in someone's eyes before he ducked behind the old hay trailer. He moved fast, but not fast enough. Her second shot caught the edge of his shoulder, not fatal but loud, and close enough to make him scream. That was the point. Let them know this wasn't a guess. Let them understand this land had been claimed by someone who didn't shoot warning shots, just shots with purpose. In the confusion, 2 others scattered their silhouettes, darting toward the tree line, one of them tripping over the wire strung low between the apple barrels. That one Ruth let run. She didn't need them all. She just needed enough confusion to disrupt the formation. From the silo, her backup camera flickered briefly on the tablet she'd mounted inside the window frame. She glanced at it quickly, confirming at least 2 more figures circling the south edge, staying low but carrying heavier gear bolt cutters, a crowbar. One of them even had what looked like a homemade battering ram. Ruth's fingers tightened around the rifle. "Not the house," she whispered, then turned and moved back inside her boots, leaving silent prints on the wooden floor like marks on a chalkboard only she could read. She reached the back hallway just as she heard the scrape of metal against the doorframe, and with one clean motion, she dropped the rifle on the bench, drew her sidearm and crouched behind the coat rack. The doorknob rattled, paused, then turned slowly, as if whoever was on the other side still believed surprise was on their side. Ruth waited until the door cracked open 3 inches before firing once through the hinge. The door slammed shut again, and a curse echoed in the dark, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps across dry grass. She didn't pursue. She didn't need to. They would regroup, but the damage was done. The quiet had been broken by a woman they never expected to still know how to fight. The minutes that followed passed not like time, but like breath measured, controlled, aware. Ruth moved through the house like a conductor tending to her orchestra, checking the trip sensors under the floorboards, adjusting the scope on the barn-facing window, realigning the smoke canister inside the pantry hatch. Her movements were exact, never rushed, never hesitant. Everything had been prepared. Everything had its place. Outside, another flare triggered, this time near the irrigation trench, followed by the sound of someone screaming into a radio, unaware that Ruth's jamming signal had blocked their transmission 10 minutes ago. She stood near the fireplace, letting the heat warm her left side rifle tucked under her arm, watching the monitor feed cycle through every angle of her land, every gate, every fence, post, every entry point. The field lights remained dark, but her view was clear. One man crawled toward the water tank, bleeding from the leg, dragging himself with one arm, while his other reached desperately for something in the dirt. She watched him struggle not with malice, but with the detached gaze of someone who had once been forced to choose between hesitation and survival too many times. "Don't," she said aloud, though he couldn't hear her. "You won't make it." And he didn't. By the time the last of the trucks peeled away in retreat, their tires spinning up dry gravel like dust, trying to become smoke, Ruth had already set the safety on her rifle and laid it gently across the table again. Her breathing had returned to normal, her hands still steady, her eyes dry. She looked down at the old floor map marked with grease pencil lines and nodded once, as if the land itself had passed some test. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt exactly what she needed to feel done. She moved to the sink, turned on the faucet, and washed her hands slowly, the water running red only for a moment before it cleared. Her reflection in the window didn't surprise her. The eyes were the same, the lines deeper, the weight unchanged. She dried her hands on a towel that had once been James's old shirt, cut and stitched after he passed, and hung it back on the hook without looking. Then she walked to the front porch again, the house behind her breathing like a creature that had survived something quiet but brutal, and sat in the same chair where she had first spotted the SUV days before. The air was cooler now, the kind of cool that follows fire but doesn't yet forgive it. She looked out at the land, at the places where shadows still shifted, and let the silence settle again, not the silence of absence but of control restored. And when she finally leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath her, she said nothing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything she'd needed to prove had already been written in smoke, in dust, in blood, and in the decision to keep standing when they thought she'd fall. The knock on the door wasn't loud, but it was firm, the kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, only announces presence. Ruth stood in the hallway, her hand still resting on the edge of the kitchen counter, breath steady, spine tall, but something in her stomach coiled in quiet tension. She hadn't called for help. She hadn't filed a complaint, and yet someone had arrived uninvited at a time of day when the sun was too high and the wind too still for casual visits. She stepped toward the door without hesitation, but she didn't open it right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that would betray what was waiting on the other side. Through the warped glass panel, she made out the silhouette, broad-shouldered, square stance hand, resting a little too close to the hip. Sheriff Abel Cobb. Of course. She took a breath, loosened her grip on the old .45 holstered beneath her sweater, and opened the door slowly, just enough to let the daylight hit her face, but keep her body behind the frame. He smiled the way men smile when they want to look neighborly but carry something sharper in their pockets. "Afternoon, Miss Langston," he said, drawing the words out like he had nowhere else to be. "Just thought I'd stop by, see how you're holding up. Heard there was a disturbance last night." His voice carried the polite rhythm of someone who's said the same thing too many times, but his eyes didn't match it. They flicked past her shoulder, scanning the hallway behind her like they already knew what to expect. "There's always a disturbance out here," she replied evenly, her tone giving nothing. "Coyotes. Wind. The occasional fool thinking I'm too old to shoot straight." The smile faltered just briefly before he pushed it back in place. "Well," he said, stepping up to the threshold, "we've been hearing things. Complaints about flares going off, unusual activity, even a few calls from concerned residents." She didn't ask which residents because she already knew none of them had names, just phone numbers rerouted through favors and silence. Ruth didn't move from the doorway. She kept one boot braced against the baseboard and both hands visible. "If anyone's concerned, they're welcome to walk this fence line and ask me themselves," she said, her voice soft but flat, like a table being cleared of unnecessary dishes. Cobb shifted his weight, placing one hand on his belt fingers, tapping against the leather near his badge as if to remind her of its presence. "You know," he said casually, "you've got a lot of land here, a lot of responsibility. Might be easier to let someone else carry that weight." She narrowed her eyes, not in anger but in focus, and let the silence hang just long enough to make the words settle into their true shape. "You didn't come here to check on me," she said. "You came here to remind me of how alone I am." For a moment he didn't reply. The wind caught his jacket, flapping the edge just enough to reveal the edge of a tucked clipboard, the corner of a folded document. He pulled it out slowly, held it between two fingers like an olive branch made of paper. "This here's just a notice of inspection," he said, tone shifting toward the mechanical. "There've been talks about soil integrity, fire code, compliance, fencing, encroachment, nothing personal." She took the paper without looking at it, held it in one hand like a bird she had no intention of keeping. Her other hand never left her hip. "You forget, Sheriff," she said. "I spent more time crawling under barbed wire than you've spent standing behind a podium. Don't come here pretending this is protocol." He swallowed once, throat tightening behind the collar of his uniform, and for a moment his eyes flicked not to her but past her to the window, to the empty yard, to the place where men with silencers had once believed they were ghosts. He took half a step back, maybe involuntarily, maybe not. "Just doing my job, Ruth," he muttered, "making sure the law's respected." Her voice dropped not in volume but in weight. "You and I both know the law doesn't get respected out here unless someone makes noise about it." She handed him back the paper, now folded once clean and sharp. "You can leave this in the mailbox next time. And if you really want to help, try figuring out who keeps sending strangers across my fence after dark." The porch creaked under his boots as he turned, tension dragging at the corners of his posture like a man who wasn't used to walking away without the last word. As he stepped off the bottom stair, she added, "And Abel." He paused back, still turned. "If you ever send someone through a back channel to scare me again, make sure they know which side the safety's on." He looked back then just once, and the mask he usually wore cracked just slightly enough to let something older and darker flicker in the space between the sheriff and the man he used to be. Then he nodded, almost like respect but not quite, and walked back toward his cruiser without another word. The tires kicked up dust as he drove away, leaving the gravel road scattered with the memory of boots and exhaust. Ruth stood on the porch until the dust settled, then stepped inside and closed the door behind her with the same calm that had greeted the knock. She didn't check the window. She didn't watch the taillights disappear. Instead, she walked to the table, unfolded the paper, and laid it beside the rifle she hadn't yet cleaned. It was just a form, unsigned, undated, unfiled, a bluff, a threat wrapped in bureaucracy. She picked up a pencil, scribbled 3 lines through the center of the page, and set it aside. Then she poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, her fingers brushing the edge of the mug with a quiet steadiness. The house was still but not silent. A breeze moved through the back room, lifting the edge of a curtain brushing against the old wall clock, whose tick had always reminded her that time, like power, only mattered if you knew how to use it. She sat at the kitchen table, the rifle beside her, the steam rising in slow spirals from the mug, and she let herself breathe, not like a woman who had been threatened, but like one who had simply been reminded of the rules of the game. Outside, the sun shifted behind a bank of clouds, and the land exhaled dust and memory rising together. Ruth didn't move. She didn't need to. Some battles weren't fought with bullets. Some were fought by staying seated in your own chair, while a man with a badge realized the law was only as strong as the person willing to enforce it. And today she'd made it clear on this land, the rules didn't belong to him. Ruth waited until twilight had thinned the edges of the sky before making the call, the kind of dusk where shadows grew long, and sounds traveled farther, even through thick air and old walls. She sat alone at the corner of the kitchen table, the handset of a rotary phone cradled between her shoulder and cheek, the cord curled loosely around her forearm like an old scar that never healed right. Her fingers tapped a rhythm against the tabletop, slow, steady, deliberate, while the line clicked once, then rang, then clicked again, before a voice answered with that familiar edge of gravel and bourbon. "You calling to say you miss me, or is it the other thing?" the man asked, his voice low but not tired, just wary. Ruth didn't smile, didn't play along. "Isaac," she said, "I need your eyes." There was silence on the other end, the kind only shared between people who've seen each other bleed and still came back anyway. After a moment, he cleared his throat. 4 square miles, he asked. 2-day loop. Or are we talking heat signatures and footprints in soft dirt? She leaned back slightly, letting the chair creak beneath her. "I want thermal movement patterns and anything crossing the property line since last Thursday." Another pause, this time longer, like he was already scrolling through mental inventory, weighing favors, checking old systems he hadn't touched in years. "You expecting visitors?" he asked. Ruth's gaze drifted toward the barn window, where the last edge of orange light hovered above the hills like a warning shot that never got fired. "They already came once," she said. "Didn't bring their names. Won't make that mistake twice." Isaac exhaled softly, not surprised, just resigned. "I'll pull from the NOAA backups, scrub the metadata, run it through 2 mirrors. You'll have it in 24. She nodded, then added, "Check for unusual signal strength along the south fence. Somebody's watching, and they're not using local bandwidth." He didn't argue. He never did. They'd been through too much to waste breath on doubt. "Got it," he said, then softer. "You good, Ruth?" She didn't answer immediately. She traced the rim of her coffee mug with 1 fingertip eyes, unfocused breath steady. "I'm here," she said, and that was enough. The line clicked, then died, and the silence that followed felt less like loneliness and more like strategy. The next morning, before the sun had cracked the spine of the east ridge, Ruth stepped into her boots, zipped up her canvas vest, and walked the northern boundary with a chalk line tucked in one pocket and a carpenter's level in the other. She moved like someone who didn't need to double-check her own work but still did, because that's what kept her alive all these years. Not just vigilance but discipline. At each elevation point she paused, knelt, measured, and marked, laying down chalk symbols that only meant something if you knew how to read field maps and survive without backup. She wasn't building a trap. She was building a system, a layered net of awareness built from angles and distances, from memory and math. Where most people saw fences and brush, Ruth saw sightlines and blind zones. She mapped them with a precision that would make a surveyor blush, all the while cataloging the lay of the land, like she was preparing for a siege she hoped wouldn't come but didn't dare ignore. By the time the sun was fully overhead, her notebook was filled with red ink slashes, altitude notes, and sketches of potential fallback points. She wasn't just defending her home, she was designing a battlefield. Back in the kitchen, she spread the notebook on the table beside her. Rifle opened the laptop she only used for encrypted scans, and inserted the thumb drive Isaac had overnighted through a contact in Abilene. It booted with a soft click, and the screen flickered once before revealing a heat map layered over aerial images of her land. Each quadrant time-stamped, each movement tagged with color-coded motion trails. She studied the loops, noting the patterns. 3 nights ago, someone had parked at the base of the gravel road for over an hour. No lights, no engine, just sat there, watching, waiting, and then vanished into the dark like mist receding before dawn. Ruth leaned back, her eyes narrowing, her breath slow. She clicked open another file, this one audio recorded off a short-range signal intercept Isaac had pulled from a repeater tower half a county away. The voices were faint, distorted, but one line came through clean-cut, by static but unmistakable. "She's got cameras. Don't trip the fence until the second team moves." Ruth paused the file, eyes steady on the waveform. "Second team," she whispered almost to herself. "So this is layered now. Not just intimidation. They're coordinating." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping back across the floor, and walked into the utility room where she kept the supply cabinet, a steel case fitted with combination locks and lined in felt. Inside were old parts she hadn't touched in years. Pressure sensors from her storm shelter, modified CB radios, outdated game cams she'd rewired with solar trickle charges. She began pulling them out one by one, checking batteries, rewiring signal ports, repurposing gear the way only someone trained in both warfare and rural survival could do. She mounted a wide-angle lens into a hollowed-out birdhouse, installed a thermal sensor into the back of a rusted mailbox, and ran fine copper tripwire through the bottom of a cattle chute until the line hummed taut like a violin string. Every motion she made was deliberate, not rushed, not panicked, but layered with the kind of resolve that came from knowing you had no one else to call, no one who'd arrive in time, no one who would ask the right questions without making you the problem. She wasn't setting traps to punish, she was setting systems to survive. The difference mattered. It always had. By dusk, the land looked untouched again, the way only a soldier knows how to hide preparation in plain sight. The hay bales were stacked exactly as before, but 3 of them now contained fiber-optic eyes. The fence looked sagging in places, but each post marked a calculated angle of elevation. Even the old wheelbarrow near the shed had been rebalanced to conceal a ground mic that would pick up engine vibrations half a mile away. She sat on the porch as night arrived, the rifle across her lap, the wind tugging gently at the hem of her coat. The stars blinked awake overhead, steady and distant, as if watching from another time. Ruth sipped her tea slowly, not to relax, but to wait, to listen, to remind herself of the silence she had earned and the fight that might still come. In the stillness, her mind returned to something Isaac had said the last time they saw each other in person years ago, after a memorial standing under a flag that flapped hard in the desert wind. "You don't build a fortress for the war you see," he'd said. "You build it for the one they don't think you remember." That line came back now, not as warning, but as instruction. Ruth wasn't afraid of who might come next. She just wanted them to understand that when they arrived, she wouldn't be waiting alone. She'd be waiting with the land itself. Watching. Listening. Ready. The next few days passed, not with sirens or statements, but with a quiet that felt unnatural, too clean, too still, as if the town itself had agreed to hold its breath without being asked. Ruth noticed it first in the way people stopped meeting her eyes at the post office, the way conversations seemed to fragment and drift away the moment she entered the feed store. It wasn't fear that clung to them, it was something more evasive, more practiced, like avoidance sewn into their Sunday clothes. Averted gazes, brief nods, hurried gestures. Even people who used to greet her by name now offered only silence, like her presence made them suddenly remember something they didn't want to. At the diner, the waitress she'd known for 15 years brought her coffee without saying a word, placing it gently on the table without the usual clatter of mug against wood. Ruth didn't blame her. She could feel the weight of something unspoken in the girl's posture, the way her eyes flicked toward the sheriff's office across the street before she turned to walk away. It wasn't about loyalty, not really. It was about proximity, how close people were willing to stand when they weren't sure what kind of trouble might start sticking to their boots. Outside the town looked the same crooked stop sign by the gas station, same faded paint on the county courthouse. But something in the rhythm had shifted. People crossed streets not to avoid Ruth, but to avoid implication, to avoid being the next person, asked to explain why they still waved to the woman everyone now whispered about. The wind still moved the flags, but the air beneath them felt thinner, like even breath had to travel quieter now. Back at the ranch, things were quieter still, but not because Ruth had stepped away. She walked the fence lines as she always had, fed the animals, swept the porch, and repaired a broken hinge on the north barn door. She moved through her routines not out of stubbornness, but because the rituals kept her connected to the soil, to the house, to the version of herself that existed before she became a target again. Yet beneath each task was a soft pressure, like a rope being pulled just tight enough to notice. Her silence had once been a choice. Now it felt like armor. On the 3rd evening after the confrontation with Cobb, she found a bouquet of wildflowers tied in twine and left on her front gate. No note, no name, just yellow coneflowers and 2 stems of firewheel tucked gently inside a mason jar. She stood staring at it for a long time, one hand resting on the latch, the other brushing the side of the jar, feeling the coolness of the glass and the warmth of the gesture at the same time. A silent thank you, maybe. A quiet sign that not everyone had turned away. She didn't take the flowers inside. She left them on the gate exactly where they'd been placed, as if to let the message remain visible for her and for whoever might pass. That night she sat out on the porch with the lights off, a blanket over her knees, her eyes adjusting slowly to the dark. The sky was cloudless, the stars steady, and for the first time in days the dogs didn't bark once. She listened to the night sound, cicadas humming in the tall grass, an owl passing low across the eastern ridge, and let the quiet fill the space around her like a second skin. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt deliberate, like a message she was finally ready to hear. Earlier that day she'd passed by the church on her way into town, and one of the elders, a man named Deacon Russell, had been standing by the steps, sweeping pine needles into a pile. He didn't wave, didn't speak, but when he saw her he paused, leaned slightly on his broom, and gave her a nod that was slower than usual, deeper. She returned it without a word, and that was enough. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't solidarity. It was something older and more honest recognition between two people who understood that sometimes dignity isn't loud, it's just consistent. Inside the house, the radio was tuned low to a local station, mostly static between gospel songs and weather updates. The DJ's voice faded in and out, announcing the temperature like it might change something. Ruth didn't turn it off. The broken signal felt strangely comforting, like proof that things still moved even if they weren't clear. She sat at the table with her notebook, flipping through pages of notes and maps, her pen hovering above the margin, as if searching not for words but for direction. She thought about writing a letter, maybe to the editor, maybe to an old friend, but in the end, she folded the notebook closed and just stared at the spine. No one would believe the full story anyway. Not without twisting it into something. It wasn't not without stripping it down to headlines and clickbait and things that missed the real weight of what had happened. That wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want to be a story. She just wanted her land to be left alone. When the phone rang just before midnight, it startled her not because of the hour, but because almost no one called anymore. She picked it up on the third ring, voice calm, expecting nothing. "Miss Langston," a young voice asked, nervous but steady. "You don't know me, but my daddy said you used to teach him in 9th grade. He said you were strict but fair. He also said you saved his brother from being expelled over a knife he didn't even bring. I just wanted you to know he's been talking about you all week, said you stood your ground like no one else could. He said you taught us all more than math." Ruth didn't speak at first. She just held the phone close, eyes closed, breath deepening with a heaviness she hadn't expected. "Tell your daddy, I remember," she said quietly, "and I'm glad someone's still listening." The line clicked, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with something deeper: connection, memory, resolve. She stood from the table, walked to the door, and opened it just wide enough to feel the night air against her face. The wind had picked up slightly, tugging at the edges of the porch awning, and somewhere in the field a cricket resumed its song. Ruth stepped outside, blanket still over her shoulders, and sat on the steps, letting the cool wood meet her spine and the stars stretch overhead without interruption. She wasn't waiting for anything. She wasn't watching for a threat. She was just breathing fully, slowly, like someone who understood that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stay. And in that moment, she felt no shame in being seen. Only the quiet strength of stillness and the knowledge that silence, when chosen, can carry a voice stronger than any shout. It began with a voicemail. Ruth hadn't expected, left on a prepaid line. She rarely used its blinking red light, casting a faint pulse on the desk like a heartbeat trying to be heard. The voice was calm, professional, clipped with just enough edge to suggest the speaker wasn't new to urgency. "Miss Langston," the woman said, "my name is Mariah Knox. I'm an attorney based out of Austin, focusing on land integrity and civil protections. We received an anonymous tip linking your mineral rights to a cluster of disputed acquisitions in Franklin and Pecos counties. I believe your case may be the thread that unravels the rest. If you're willing to speak off the record, I'll come to you. No cameras, no entourage, just facts." Ruth listened twice before deleting the message. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she didn't need a recording to remember what mattered. She sat still for a long time afterward, the early light just beginning to touch the windows, spreading thin gold across the floorboards like a promise she hadn't asked for. Her fingers rested on the armrest, still rough, with calluses from tools, weapons, and long afternoons spent patching the corners of a home that refused to lean. By mid-afternoon, Mariah was standing on Ruth's porch, dressed in jeans and boots instead of heels, her black blazer folded over one arm, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She introduced herself with a nod, not a handshake, and said, "I don't want to waste your time. What you've experienced isn't just illegal, it's patterned, coordinated, quiet." Ruth didn't offer a seat. She didn't need to. "Show me," she said, voice low, but level the way people speak when they're not surprised anymore, just confirming. They sat at the kitchen table as the wind shifted outside, rattling the window panes and setting the curtains to moving like slow breath. Mariah pulled out a binder thick and worn, its pages clipped with sticky notes and paper tabs in multiple colors. She laid out maps with overlapping grids, copies of property filings, satellite imagery, stitched together from 3 separate agencies. She pointed to one photo, a cluster of dark vehicles parked near the boundary line, and said, "This was 2 days before the sheriff showed up with that notice. That's not a coincidence." Ruth leaned forward, not blinking her hand, sliding across the edge of the photo like she was reading Braille instead of pixels. "They've done this before," she said quietly. Mariah nodded. "7 times that we know of. 5 in this county. 2 just over the border. Always targeting rural black landowners. Always around legacy, mineral rights. And always with the same 3-step process: unannounced visits, fake filings, and a last-minute offer dressed up to look like rescue." Ruth looked up then, her gaze steady. "And what happens when someone says no?" Mariah didn't flinch. "Usually they don't get the chance to say it twice." The house was still around them, the ticking clock on the wall, the only thing marking time, but something in the air had shifted, as if the walls themselves had started listening. Ruth stood and walked to the cabinet, pulled out a folder she hadn't opened since the winter James died, and slid it across the table. Inside were her own records, not just deeds and titles, but handwritten notes, field sketches, receipts, letters from her late husband, documenting strange conversations and unexplained delays. Mariah flipped through them with the kind of focus that made Ruth believe she wasn't the first person this woman had fought for, and wouldn't be the last. "This isn't just evidence," Mariah said, holding up one of the maps James had annotated in red ink. "This is the foundation of a civil RICO case. If we pursue it, we're not just going after individuals, we're going after the structure." Ruth remained silent for a while, her arms folded loosely across her chest, gaze drifting toward the field through the back window where the pecan trees bent in the breeze. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before but no less certain. "I don't want headlines. I don't want interviews. I just want them to stop." Mariah met her eyes and said simply, "Then we start with the truth. And we build outward." That night, Ruth sat alone again at the kitchen table, Mariah long gone, her binder tucked neatly into a canvas bag with Ruth's copies nestled inside. The house smelled faintly of dust and lemon oil, the wind still whispering across the porch like a warning now shared. She poured a small cup of bourbon, not for comfort, but for memory, and set it on the edge of the table beside the folder. She didn't toast, didn't speak. She just sat there, breathing evenly, letting the weight of it all press down until it flattened into resolve. The next morning the story broke, not on television or radio, but online, in an investigative blog run by a former journalist Mariah trusted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't use her name. It didn't even mention the gunfire. It just detailed a pattern: 7 cases, 1 anonymous source evidence, cross-referenced with public records, satellite logs, and internal memos leaked from a drilling company with offshore ties. Ruth read it slowly, line by line, her finger tracking across the screen like she was tracing something sacred. The comments were quiet at first, then steady: farmers, teachers, lawyers, even veterans from states she'd never visited, all saying the same thing: "I thought it was just me." By the second day, a local radio station picked it up, then a podcast, then a regional news outlet known for chasing corruption cases others wouldn't touch. Ruth didn't answer her phone. She didn't need to. The sound of her silence had already begun to echo louder than anything she could have said. What mattered was movement, and it had begun. That afternoon, a young man parked his truck just outside the main gate. He didn't come up the driveway. He just stood by the fence, holding a paper grocery bag and staring at the house like he wasn't sure if he had the right place. Ruth stepped outside, arms crossed, watching him without approaching. He raised the bag slightly awkwardly, then called out, "My grandma used to talk about you. Said you once kept her son from dropping out when no one else would look twice. Said you believed him when he said he couldn't read the board from the back of the room." He set the bag down, still not stepping any closer. "I brought eggs and tomatoes from our place." Then he turned and left, truck door closing softly behind him, engine fading into the quiet that returned as quickly as it had left. Ruth didn't move for a long time. She just stood there, letting the breeze lift the edges of her shirt, her eyes on the brown paper bag, now resting against the fence like a tribute. And when she finally walked over, bent to pick it up and cradled it in her arms like something fragile, she didn't think about war or corruption or what might come next. She just thought, someone still remembers what we're worth. And for the first time in weeks, that was enough. It started with a single post, just a photo, no caption, shared by a high school student named Deshaun Miller, who lived 3 towns over and had only heard of Ruth Langston through an uncle who once did roofing work on her barn. The picture showed Ruth standing alone by her gate, arms crossed, wind curling the edge of her coat, her face unreadable beneath the brim of her old canvas hat. He'd taken the photo from the road through the windshield, caught off guard by how still she looked, how much her posture reminded him of his own grandmother when she stood in the doorway watching the world like it owed her an answer. By nightfall, the photo had been reshared 2,000 times, first by classmates, then by veterans' pages, then by groups of young activists who didn't know Ruth's name but recognized something ancient in the way she held herself against the horizon. "This is the kind of strength they never teach in school," one caption read. "This is what resilience looks like without a podium," said another. And somewhere between midnight and morning, the silence that had hung like dust over Ruth's name began to shift, not with noise but with movement. When Ruth checked her old laptop the next morning, half expecting nothing but pop-ups and expired passwords, she found her inbox flooded with messages from names she didn't recognize. Young people mostly writing from Texas, Georgia, Oregon, even as far as Maine. Some shared stories about their own families, about land lost to shady deals or relatives they couldn't convince to fight one more time. Others just thanked her for standing firm, for not folding for, reminding them that sometimes the most radical form of protest is to remain exactly where you are and refuse to disappear. She read each one slowly, sometimes twice, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard, as if replying might disturb something sacred. "Dear Miss Langston," one message began. "My name is Elena and I'm 21 years old. I've never met anyone like you, but I see your face, and it reminds me that strength isn't about anger, it's about truth. If there's anything I can do, even just to write your story in my college paper, I want to help." Ruth leaned back, eyes stinging slightly, not from sadness but from recognition. There was something in the tone of these letters, a clarity she hadn't expected. They weren't pitying her. They weren't trying to save her. They were saying, "We see you, we believe you, and we're here." That same afternoon, a small group of students from a nearby community college showed up at the edge of her driveway, not with signs or slogans, but with folding chairs, bottled water, and hand-drawn maps they'd made based on her satellite reports. One of them, barely 22, with a denim jacket stitched full of patches, walked up the porch steps and said, "Ma'am, we're not here to get in your way. We just want to learn what you know. If you'll teach us, we'll listen." Ruth stared at him for a long moment, measuring his sincerity, the way his hands stayed still at his sides, the way he didn't fidget or try to prove anything with his posture. Then she nodded slowly and motioned toward the chairs. "If you're gonna sit, sit in the shade," she said. "And bring notebooks." I don't repeat myself. They came every afternoon that week, 5 or 6 at a time, never more. Some brought food. Others helped patch fencing or rewired motion sensors. Ruth taught them how to measure wind drift, how to track tire marks in dried soil, how to recognize the way silence sounds different when it's watching you. But more than that, she taught them about time, how land remembers how history stains, how wounds don't always bleed in red. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned golden against the edge of her front porch, a girl named Talia asked, "Were you scared when they came the first time?" Ruth didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands on her jeans, glanced at the dog lying by the step, then looked straight at her. "Being scared and being still aren't the same thing," she said. "You don't survive by avoiding fear. You survive by walking through it like it's wind." The group fell quiet after that, each of them letting the words settle without needing to unpack them. And in that quiet, Ruth saw something rare: respect, not for her story, but for the fact that she hadn't waited for someone else to tell it. Later that night, after everyone had gone, she stood at the edge of the porch, one hand resting on the column, the other holding a folded letter. A boy had slipped into her mailbox without signing. It read, "Thank you for standing still long enough for us to find you." She read it again, slower this time, then tucked it between the pages of her notebook like a pressed flower, fragile but enduring. The stars came out in full that night, unobscured by clouds or doubt, and Ruth sat with her back to the house, eyes lifted toward the sky, the kind of stillness around her that wasn't empty but earned. Somewhere in the distance, an engine rumbled across gravel far enough not to be threat close enough to remind her she wasn't forgotten. She didn't know where all those kids would go or what they'd carry forward. But she knew this: when the ground shakes beneath you, it's not always collapse. Sometimes it's a signal that roots are growing deeper than before. And for the first time in a long time, Ruth Langston believed that maybe the land wouldn't just outlast them all. Maybe, just maybe, it would remember who stayed. The sun had barely climbed above the low hills when Ruth heard the first knock, not on her door, but on her gate, 3 sharp raps against metal that echoed like a challenge across the stillness of morning. She didn't flinch. She'd been expecting this moment, though not precisely today, and not with this much calm in her chest. She tied the front of her worn flannel shirt, stepped into her boots, and walked out onto the porch, letting the wood creak beneath her like a familiar greeting. Two people stood on the other side of the fence, one in a dark windbreaker with a Department of Justice seal on the sleeve, the other holding a camera bag slung low against his hip. No media vans, no shouting, just quiet posture and eyes that said they weren't here for spectacle. Ruth nodded once and unlatched the gate. "If you're here for coffee, you'll have to make it yourself," she said evenly. The man in the windbreaker cracked a slight smile. "Actually, ma'am," he said, "we're here because your name came up in an investigation we can no longer ignore." She held his gaze for a beat, then stepped aside and gestured toward the porch. "Then you'd better sit down. This'll take longer than you think." Inside the air was warm, with the scent of cedar and old books, and the light came in slanted through the east windows, catching on the brass lamp she kept by the table. The agent, he introduced himself as Calvin Torres, sat straight-backed but not stiff, flipping open a narrow leather notebook, as if he'd done this before many times. His partner, a quiet woman named Sarah Nguyen, kept to the side adjusting a small lapel mic and testing the audio levels like she was trained not just to record, but to listen. Ruth didn't tell them everything at once. She let the story unfurl in layers like peeling the husk off corn, slow, deliberate, each detail held carefully before letting it fall. She began with the fence line, with the noise that wasn't quite thunder, with the vehicles no one could quite identify, but everyone pretended not to notice. Then she told them about the sheriff's letter, the sudden appearance of compliance notices. She'd never requested the way her mail started arriving, torn or not at all. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just told it like a woman used to being doubted and done, caring whether people believed her. Agent Torres took notes with the kind of pen that doesn't scratch. He never interrupted. Once when Ruth paused to pour herself water, he looked up and said, "You've kept detailed records." She glanced at the stack of folders she'd placed between them. "When no one listens," she said, "you learn to keep receipts." By the time the clock chimed noon, the porch had grown warm, and the sound of cicadas buzzed through the air like static on an old radio. Ruth brought out a plate of sliced peaches and a tin of cornbread she'd baked the night before, more out of habit than hospitality. Sarah Nguyen smiled softly and accepted a piece, thanking her with a quiet grace that didn't feel rehearsed. "People will want to hear your voice, Miss Langston," she said. "They'll want to put a face to the story." Ruth raised an eyebrow and leaned back in her chair. "Then they'd better be ready for wrinkles and truth. I don't speak in sound bites." Within 48 hours, the first piece aired not on a major network, but on a local PBS affiliate out of San Antonio, narrated by a young journalist named Travis Harper, who introduced the story with the respect of someone raised by women who had seen worse and spoken less. The footage was simple: Ruth, walking along the edge of her field at sunset, her silhouette framed against the golden grass, voice steady as she recounted how silence could be a form of resistance. That evening, the phones at the county office began ringing, not with outrage, but with questions. Is it true she never missed a property tax payment in 30 years? Did the county really approve that pipeline survey without her consent? How many other black landowners were audited last year? The questions were small, but they grew fast. And by the third day, they were no longer being asked quietly. Ruth watched it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with the solemnity of someone watching a tree they planted decades ago finally bear fruit. She didn't need applause. What she wanted was sunlight, truth pulled into the open, where rot couldn't hide behind paper and jargon. Her neighbors began waving again, but more carefully this time, like they understood now that standing near her meant being counted, not just seen. One morning, a news crew from Dallas arrived without warning, cameras already rolling as they stepped from the van. Ruth met them halfway down the drive and said simply, "Turn that off, unless you plan on listening. I don't perform for pain." To their credit, they stopped. The reporter, a woman in her early 30s, with a no-nonsense haircut and a calm voice, took out a notebook and asked if Ruth would rather speak on her own terms. "Terms," Ruth repeated. "Truth is the term." Behind the scenes, the DOJ began issuing subpoenas quietly at first. Then, with more urgency, land records were pulled, emails surfaced. 2 county clerks were placed on administrative leave. A former deputy came forward with a sworn statement detailing years of backdoor deals and intimidation tactics. The case, once seen as a footnote in a rural dispute, began spreading like wildfire through the legal blogs, then the advocacy networks, then the national outlets. Still, Ruth remained where she was on her porch in her boots, her voice unchanged. She gave exactly one interview to a national network, but only after insisting it be filmed on her land with no lighting crews and no makeup. When asked what justice would look like, she didn't hesitate. "It's not about punishing," she said. "It's about repairing. It's about making the road smooth for the ones coming after me." 1 week later, a town hall was called, first time in nearly a decade, and the room was packed with more young people than Ruth had seen in years. They brought notebooks, phones, questions. Some cried, some didn't speak. But all of them listened. Ruth sat in the back, a quiet presence, letting the energy move through the room like a wind that didn't need her to blow. It only needed her to have stood long enough for others to see which way to lean. By the time she returned home, the sky had turned a soft indigo, and the porch lights flicked on, automatically bathing the old wood in warmth. She stood for a moment by the door, her hand resting on the latch eyes, scanning the field out front where the grass swayed gently under the first touch of night. No trucks, no threats, just space. Inside, the phone rang once, then stopped. Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, the world was already shifting, like a machine being pulled apart piece by piece, its false gears tossed out into the light. And she, just one woman on one small farm with one true story, had started the turning. The wind had shifted by late afternoon, brushing through the cottonwoods like fingers combing back the hair of the land, and Ruth could feel it. Something was coming, not from nature but from people. The kind of tension that settles in your bones before it touches the skin, like a storm that announces itself through silence first. She sat on the edge of her porch, her back, straight eyes steady, watching a pair of county cruisers ease down the gravel road with a cautious slowness that didn't match the urgency rising in her chest. They parked at a distance, not out of respect but calculation, and when the doors opened, she recognized the figure stepping out: Sheriff Byron Keller, a man whose handshake always came with a warning and whose smile never reached his eyes. He was younger than her by nearly 20 years, but his boots were too polished for someone who claimed to understand land. He approached with his deputy in tow, speaking before he reached the fence. "Miss Langston," he said, "we're following up on reports of unauthorized gatherings. There's concern about escalation." Ruth didn't move. Concern from whom, she asked. Keller gave a practiced shrug. Calls came in. Neighbors worried about disturbances, possible militia activity. The lie wasn't even well crafted. Ruth let the pause stretch, then replied, "You mean students with notebooks, veterans fixing fences, that the kind of uprising you're afraid of now?" Keller's mouth tightened. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here to assess." "Then assess from the road," she said. "You've got no warrant and no business past that gate." The deputy shifted slightly, his hand resting just above his holster, but Ruth's eyes didn't leave Keller's face. It was a quiet standoff, the kind that didn't need weapons to be loud. In the background, the wind stirred the pecan branches, casting restless shadows across the dry earth. Keller didn't press forward, not yet. He turned after a moment, walking back to the cruiser with a look that said this wasn't over, it was just recorded. Ruth exhaled slowly once the engine faded behind the trees, then turned and went back inside, where the tension clung to the walls like humidity, thick and invisible. She poured herself a glass of water and drank half before placing it on the windowsill, her hands gripping the frame, her eyes scanning the edges of her land, as if memorizing what might soon be contested. That night, an email from Mariah Knox came through with a single line: "They're watching county data, expect pressure." Ruth stared at the words for a long moment, then closed the laptop and walked out, back where the stars were beginning to blink open across the wide Texas sky. She stood still, breathing the dry air, remembering the way her father used to say, "When they lean in too close, girl, it's not because they care, it's because you scare 'em." By morning, the pressure had a new shape. A call came from the tax assessor's office, a routine review of past filings. Then, a permit notice from the utility board citing potential land use violations. Each one with language vague enough to sound innocent, sharp enough to cut. Ruth didn't flinch. She made a list. She logged every letter, every call, every knock. She'd fought bigger before and quieter. But it wasn't just paper pushing anymore. A city council member from the neighboring district called a special meeting citing rural instability. A retired judge was quoted in the Franklin Herald saying, "When private citizens attract national attention, they often invite outside agitation." The article didn't name Ruth, but everyone knew. It was her land on the evening news. Her voice layered under headlines that didn't understand her silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Still, something deeper gnawed at her, an unease, not about herself, but those now standing beside her. The students, the neighbors, the old soldiers who had come not to fight but to witness. She saw the worry in their eyes, the caution growing in their steps. One afternoon, when Talia helped carry supplies to the barn, she paused and asked Miss Langston, "Are we safe here?" Ruth looked at her for a long beat. "No one's ever been safe standing up," she said. "But that's never been the point." Even so, Ruth didn't want anyone blindsided. That evening she called a gathering, not an emergency meeting, not a protest, just a circle. They met in the barn where the wood smelled of oil and dust and memory, and she laid it all out, what was coming, what had shifted, what it might cost. She didn't sugarcoat, she didn't dramatize, she just told the truth. When she finished, the room was still for a long time. Then an older man with weathered hands and a Marine Corps pin on his jacket stood up and said, "Ma'am, I was scared in 1968 too, but I still showed up." A quiet nod passed around the room. No one left. But the escalation wasn't waiting. 3 days later, drones appeared unmarked, low-flying, circling her property in patterns too precise to be coincidence. Ruth filmed them from her porch, her hand steady, her voice calm. She sent the footage to Mariah, who forwarded it to a contact in Washington. An hour later, Ruth received a call, not from a lawyer but from a retired military intelligence officer who'd read her story and said, "They're trying to make you blink first. Don't." She didn't, but she did act. She organized everything, every file, every photograph, every journal entry. She backed them up twice and mailed copies to 3 separate safe addresses. She gave Sarah Nguyen access to her archives and told her plainly, "If they silence me, you speak louder." Sarah looked at her with something between fear and awe. "You don't plan to back down, do you?" Ruth shook her head. "Not today. Not ever." And then for a moment there was quiet again. Not peace, but the eye of the storm. Ruth stood at the far edge of her land, facing west, the sun setting in gold and fire behind the trees, her rifle slung across her back, not as a threat, but as history. She didn't smile. She didn't pose. She just stood there, one woman against a government learning too late that dignity doesn't bow. And for the first time since it all began, she felt not fear but clarity, like the ground beneath her feet had finally remembered her name. The courthouse in Elmswood wasn't grand or modern. It was an old brick building with scuffed steps, faded shutters, and the kind of wooden benches that creaked under time more than weight. But that morning it felt like the eyes of the country had turned to this very spot. News vans lined the street, their antennae pointed skyward like steel reeds. Cameramen drank bitter gas station coffee. Reporters whispered lines to producers rehearsing the opening shots of what they hoped would be history. But inside, the woman they came for sat alone at a table near the front, not rehearsing, not reading, just breathing. Ruth Langston wore a dark navy blouse, buttoned clean, her silver hair pinned neatly in a low roll. She didn't fidget. She didn't glance around the room. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, one folded over the other, like a woman who knew how long she'd waited for this moment. Not out of revenge or vindication, but because silence had run out of places to hide. Across from her, the county's legal counsel looked nervous. They shuffled papers, whispered to aides, avoided eye contact. Sheriff Keller sat in the back, not in uniform, flanked by 2 lawyers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The judge entered quietly, an older black man with steel in his spine and a voice like gravel soaked in tea. When he called the hearing to order, there was no drama, no gavel slam, just a simple, "Let's begin." The prosecution started first trying to paint the matter as a misunderstanding, a zoning conflict gone awry, procedural, not personal. They called it bureaucratic backlog, clerical overlap, and miscommunication between agencies. But every word floated in the air like smoke, visible but impossible to hold. Ruth sat still, her face unreadable, until the judge finally turned to her and said, "Miss Langston, you may proceed." She stood without hesitation. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. Her boots clicked softly against the floor. She didn't carry notes. Her voice didn't rise. She simply began. "For 47 years I have paid my taxes, filed my deeds, and maintained this land without fail or favor," she said. "I've buried kin here, raised crops here, and stood guard over memories this county would rather forget. What's happening isn't about paperwork, it's about power." A soft hush swept the courtroom. Ruth didn't blink. She continued recounting how the property inspections began just weeks after her interview aired, how the code violations appeared suddenly after years of perfect compliance, how the sheriff's department redirected patrols through her road at odd hours, logging her visitors and photographing license plates, "This is not coincidence," she said. "This is consequence for refusing to be quiet." The room didn't erupt. It breathed. People shifted forward, leaned in, felt their backs straighten slightly, like her voice had reached the bones they didn't know were hunched. Then she began to name names, not with accusation, but with receipts. She read dates, file numbers, inconsistencies. She described meetings. She never requested citations that had no basis, letters that went unanswered for weeks until cameras showed up. Halfway through, she paused, not because she faltered, but because she remembered. She turned to the bench and said softly, "Judge, I know this isn't the first time justice has been slow for people who look like me. I grew up in a town where my father couldn't vote but paid taxes anyway, where my mother had to stand while others sat even if she was older or tired or in pain. We knew the law didn't always protect us, but we respected it because we believed it could grow." Then she looked across the courtroom and said, "This land isn't just mine, it's my history's last witness." And they tried to erase it without ever firing a bullet. One of the council members sitting in the front row wiped his eyes. Not performatively, just quietly, like something he'd forgotten had finally tapped him on the shoulder. When Ruth finished, she didn't bow. She simply stepped back and sat down, her breathing steady, her gaze unshaken. The judge thanked her not as a formality, but as a man who understood the cost of truth spoken out loud. Then he motioned to the next witness. To the surprise of many, it was Daniel Hartwell, a former sheriff's deputy who had resigned 2 years earlier without public explanation. He looked older now, grayer at the temples, more careful in posture. When he took the stand, his voice cracked just slightly. "I served under Sheriff Keller for 6 years, he began. "I followed orders. I didn't always understand until I realized what they were meant to do." He described internal memos targeting specific landowners. He described pressure to investigate Ruth, not for violations but for optics. She was too visible, he said, too composed, too respected, and that scared people more than 1,000 protests. By the time the third witness, a federal analyst, took the stand, confirming digital surveillance anomalies near Ruth's property, the room had shifted again, not toward outrage, but toward reckoning. People weren't angry. They were alert, like they were starting to see the outline of a system that had long stood in the shadows. And in that awareness, something rare occurred. The judge called a recess not to deliberate, but to allow space. The courtroom emptied slowly, people stepping outside into the warmth of late afternoon, blinking against sunlight like it too had something to say. Ruth remained seated inside her fingers, resting lightly against the polished table. She watched as lawyers shuffled papers, as aides whispered. As the deputy court clerk offered her a glass of water she didn't ask for, she accepted it anyway. Because kindness, even late, was still better than absence. Outside, a group of high school students from Austin approached the courthouse steps. They hadn't come for credit or spectacle. They'd come because their teacher had played the PBS clip in class. One girl wore a shirt with Ruth's quote printed across the front. "Truth is the only term I speak." Another carried a sign that read, "Land remembers what courts forget." Later, as the session reconvened and closing arguments were scheduled, a man rose quietly from the audience and asked the court's permission to speak. It was Calvin Torres, the DOJ agent who'd first visited Ruth's farm. He stood not as investigator but as witness. "I've seen how these systems twist slow," he said, "but I've never seen someone make them turn back." The judge nodded solemnly and adjourned for the day. No ruling yet. No verdict. But something had cracked. As Ruth walked out beneath the arched doors of that old courthouse, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They simply stood as if witnessing something sacred, something finally named. The wind picked up again, brushing against the flags above, tugging at Ruth's sleeve as if to say, "You moved something today." She looked up once, then turned toward the parking lot, her footsteps steady, her shadow stretching long behind her like a line drawn in the dirt that no one dared cross again. The morning of the verdict brought no storm, no clamor. Just a gentle sun spilling over the roof of the Elmswood courthouse, mist fading in the crisp November air, and old wooden benches wiped down to a quiet polish, as if someone new today left no room for carelessness. Ruth Langston arrived early, not out of anxiety but out of habit. She believed decent folks should be present before the bell rang, not to beg but to remind themselves they had nothing to fear. She chose the second row, same seat as always, where she could see the bench and judge's dais without craning her neck. Locals came in slowly after her. No shouting, no signs, no chants. Just soft handshakes and exchanged looks between those who understood today was the result of many sleepless nights and months of steady courage. "You doing all right?" an older woman asked gently, taking the seat beside her. "I've walked through worse," Ruth replied with a calm smile. "Only this time I'm bringing the whole town with me." When Judge Foster entered, he didn't need the gavel to call for silence. The room already held its own weight. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the chamber like a steady bell. "The court has reviewed all testimony, evidence, and records related to the case of Langston versus Elmswood County. Following an independent audit by the State Inspector General, this court issues the following statements." He paused not for effect, but to ensure every soul in that room was truly listening. He began by listing the administrative violations, falsified reports, unlawful surveillance, spontaneous investigations with no warrants and no legal basis. All carried out systematically, he said, with clear intent to intimidate, discredit, and destroy the standing of a lawful citizen. This not only violates local governance codes, it desecrates the foundational commitments of our state constitution. The soft scratch of a pen met the moment. A courtroom without applause, but eyes that blinked back the sting of long-held disbelief. Ruth Langston was right, not emotionally, but legally, factually, and finally. The judge continued. "The Elmswood County Sheriff's Office, under the leadership of Mr. Byron Keller, is hereby suspended from supervisory function for 30 days, pending mandatory restructuring under State Department of Justice oversight." A sharp breath was heard somewhere behind. In addition, the County Oversight Board shall be held publicly accountable through a mandatory civic hearing within 60 days to review governance structures and budgetary discretion. There was no cheering. No one leapt to their feet. But in those exchanged glances was something harder to define, perhaps relief, perhaps the quiet restoration of dignity, or maybe just the undeniable proof that justice, though slow, can still find its way to those who need it most. When the hearing adjourned, Ruth didn't rise right away. She sat quietly for a moment, gently rubbing the palm of her hand, as if coaxing calm after a long-distance march. When she did rise, something strange happened. No one said a word, but the entire room stood up with her. Not for titles, not for victory, but for witnessing something rare. A woman who didn't meet corruption with fire, didn't choose retaliation, but took the hard road of integrity and spoke truth with a steady voice. "Can I hug you?" a teenage girl asked softly as Ruth stepped outside. Ruth smiled and wrapped her arms around her as if she were holding her younger self, still strong, still bruised, but no longer alone. The headlines didn't scream. Local news gave it a quiet lead. But what happened in that courthouse traveled differently through family dinners, through civics classes in small-town schools, through town hall meetings, where residents began asking harder questions, listening longer, and believing more in their own role. A week later, Ruth was invited to speak at a public hearing at the University of Texas Law School. She didn't give a long speech, just told her story in the same plain-spoken way she had in court. "I don't want to be remembered as the woman who won a lawsuit," she said. "I want to be remembered as someone who didn't look away when someone needed to stand up." When she finished, she stood beside the large window in the back of the hall where the late afternoon light traced her silhouette across the granite wall. Outside, winter came slowly, but it wasn't cold. Her land still stood. The soil hadn't softened the trees, hadn't budded, but she knew, as she always had good things, take time to root. She closed her eyes briefly and listened to the wind brushing past the pane, carrying the scent of dry grass, old wood, and something else that felt familiar, like youth that never entirely leaves. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw wasn't law books or banners. It was the steady gaze of a red-haired student standing at the back of the room, hand placed quietly over her heart as Ruth stepped down from the podium. No one had told that girl to do it. But she did, and Ruth understood something had shifted, not loudly, not quickly, but truthfully. Months passed, but the echo of Ruth Langston's name never quite faded from the conversations in Elmswood. Not in the grocery store lines, not during the Sunday potlucks, and certainly not at the school board meetings where, for the first time in years, parents stayed until the final gavel. There was something different now, not loud or boastful, but rooted like the shift in soil before spring. People started using her name the way they used to speak of grandfathers who marched in Selma, or grandmothers who refused to move from their bus seats, not as a symbol, but as someone who reminded them what decency looked like when tested. The town council chambers, once sparsely attended, began filling early. Folding chairs lined the back wall. Older men who once watched from porches now took notes during public hearings. High school students shadowed council members, some out of school credit requirements, others out of a quiet curiosity, awakened by the trial they couldn't stop talking about in government class. It just felt like she was doing it for all of us. A student named Jordan said during a youth panel, fidgeting slightly but eyes steady, like, the adults we needed finally showed up. Even the local police department, long a source of whispered fear, began hosting open office hours. Sheriff Keller had resigned quietly without ceremony or protest, and in his place stood Captain Naomi Guzman, a decorated veteran, a woman of few words but a steady spine. She didn't promise the moon, she promised transparency, quarterly reports, and a monthly community roundtable. No badge is above accountability, she told the crowd during her first address. Not mine, not anyone, and if I ever forget that, remind me. No one clapped. But no one looked away either. Churches that had avoided politics from the pulpit now spoke openly of justice as part of faith. Pastor Monroe of Second Baptist began his sermons not just with scripture, but with stories of people in the pews who had once stayed silent out of fear. "You can't heal a wound if you won't look at it," he said one Sunday, his voice gentle but unflinching. "And our town's been limping long enough." Ruth, for her part, didn't seek a spotlight. She returned to her farm, repaired the broken gate herself, and planted marigolds where the fencing had been torn apart. She went to town only when needed groceries, voting the occasional library visit to borrow war history books for her neighbor's son, who had taken to calling her Miss Ruth, the real soldier. She would laugh softly when he said it, but her eyes always lingered a little longer on the horizon after. She was asked several times to run for public office. She declined each time with the same answer: "I've done my part. Now it's time for others to stand where they used to sit." Still, her presence lingered on community flyers, in local college lectures, in the dusty frame above the fireplace at the town museum, where her photo hung next to the words, "She stood when it mattered." One day, during a civic engagement event hosted by a retired teachers association, Ruth spoke briefly not about herself but about legacy. "Justice," she said, "is not a place you arrive at. It's something you maintain like an old house. You patch the roof, you repaint the trim, and you keep the porch light on in case someone else needs to find their way home." There was a pause after she spoke, not out of confusion, but out of respect, as if everyone needed a moment to let the weight of that truth settle in their bones. That night, the town square felt different. Not brighter, not louder, just more awake. The windows of City Hall glowed with handwritten signs, "Thank you, Ruth Elmswood stands together," and one taped near the post office window that simply read, "We remember," not in protest, in promise. And somewhere out near the edge of her land, Ruth stood quietly beside her fence line, watching the last rays of dusk fade over the hills. A soft breeze moved the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of soil, cedar, and the faintest echo of children laughing in the distance, laughter she hadn't heard on this land in years. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it fill her, steady her, and remind her that even after the battles, there was still something sacred in just continuing. The season turned slowly, like a page being turned by an old hand, steady, deliberate, without fanfare. Autumn faded into a Texas winter, mild but firm, and with it came a quiet kind of renewal. The town of Elmswood didn't erupt with change overnight, but the rhythm had shifted. It was in the way people lingered longer after church to talk about school budgets, or how the library's Thursday night civic sessions now had standing room only, with elders and teens sitting shoulder to shoulder sharing microphones, and sometimes disagreements respectfully. Ruth Langston stayed mostly out of sight, tending to her land with the same devotion she once gave to discipline and duty. Her shotgun remained in the barn, wrapped in oiled cloth, untouched since the raid. But it wasn't forgotten. Nothing truly disappeared out here. Stories settled into soil, the way rain settled into cracks, bringing things back to life when least expected. One morning she received a letter, not from a politician, not from a reporter, but from a young girl named Delilah who lived just 2 towns over. The envelope was hand-folded, edges uneven, but the handwriting was deliberate. "Dear Miss Ruth," it began, "my teacher said you made something wrong. Turn right. I want to be like you when I grow up, even if I'm scared sometimes." Did you ever get scared? Ruth read the letter 3 times before setting it on the windowsill, sunlight pooling over the words like a quiet answer. Later that week, she made a visit to Elmswood Elementary. She didn't announce it, just walked into the front office and asked if she could read a book to the 4th graders. The staff, nearly stunned, silent, nodded quickly and ushered her down the hall. She chose The People Could Fly, a tale of hope stitched into struggle of ordinary folks, discovering something extraordinary deep inside them. When she finished reading, a boy raised his hand and asked, "Is that story real?" Ruth smiled gently and replied, "It is if we make it real." That single moment, captured in a blurry phone photo and shared by a teacher on social media, went farther than any article ever had. People from across the state sent letters, books, and invitations asking Ruth to speak, to lead, to advise. She accepted only a few, always with the same quiet condition: "If it's for the young folks, I'll be there." Elmswood, meanwhile, began planting seeds of its own. The town council created a Truth and Accountability Committee made up of everyday residents, farmers, veterans, teachers, and retired nurses. Their job wasn't to prosecute, but to listen, document, and recommend. "We're not chasing ghosts," one member said. "We're closing the doors they used to walk through." And for the first time in decades, budget meetings opened with community voices instead of bureaucratic memos. Pastor Monroe, inspired by Ruth's quiet strength, led a monthly walking circle around the courthouse, a gesture of remembrance and presence. "Justice is not just what we demand," he often said, "it's what we practice with our feet." Children joined with chalk in their hands, writing phrases like, "We see you, truth lives here, and honor the land, honor the people on the courthouse steps." By the end of each walk, the square would glow in color and resolve. One evening, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, flipping through the local paper where a small headline read, "Elmswood Students Win State Award for Civic Engagement." She read about their project, how they'd researched voter suppression in rural counties, interviewed seniors who had been turned away decades ago, and built a digital archive to preserve those stories. She recognized one of the last names. The girl was Keller's niece, the same Keller who once led the raid on her property. Ruth sat back for a long moment, processing the complexity, the grace, the unexpected full circle. A knock came at the door. It was her neighbor, Mr. Lewis, holding a jar of preserves and a slight smile. "Saw the story," he said quietly. "Figured you'd want a taste of something sweet to go with it." Ruth laughed the sound, soft but warm, and waved him inside. As he set the jar on her counter, she poured him tea without asking. They sat for a while, the way older folks do, not rushing, not needing to fill the space, just existing in the comfort of survival and recognition. Outside, the stars had begun to prick the sky. Coyotes howled somewhere near the far fence, but they kept their distance. The wind carried the smell of pine and old ash, and something fresh like earth just turned ready for planting. Ruth looked out past the porch, railing past the silhouette of the barn, and whispered almost to herself, "We did more than make it through, we made it matter." And in that moment, with her hands curled around the mug and her eyes reflecting the porch light, there was no sorrow, no bitterness, just the quiet certainty that healing didn't mean forgetting, and justice didn't always wear a badge or carry a gavel. Sometimes it wore denim and boots and smelled like soil. Sometimes it came home and stayed a while. Sometimes the strongest voices aren't the loudest, they're the ones that endure, that stay standing when others fall silent. Ruth Langston didn't seek justice for attention or revenge. She stood because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that dignity isn't something we're given, it's something we uphold even when no one's watching. In today's world, it's easy to feel powerless, to think the fight belongs to the young or the loud. But stories like Ruth's show us that wisdom, experience, and quiet resilience are more powerful than we think. Healing a community doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with showing up, listening, and planting the kind of truth that grows beyond our lifetimes. So if you've ever wondered whether your voice still matters, it does. Whether it's voting, speaking up at a town hall, or simply teaching a child what justice looks like, you're not too late and it's not too small. Because when we carry our stories with pride and pass on what we've learned, we don't just preserve the past, we shape the future. And that, my friends, is how a legacy begins. If this story moved you, helped you reflect, or reminded you of someone you know, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who still believes in quiet courage. We're honored to have you here.